Story 1.
Dusk was descending on the city, a gradual dimming of light that seemed to drain the color from the world. The sky, a canvas of oranges and pinks, slowly succumbed to the encroaching shades of twilight. In this intermediary time, the city seemed to hold its breath, caught between the bustle of day and the quiet of night. The harbor, usually a hub of activity, was unusually serene. The sounds of the city seemed muffled here, as if the water itself absorbed the noise, leaving only the haunting call of distant seagulls and the occasional creak of moored boats. The cold wind blew mercilessly, a herald of winter, carrying with it piercing drops of rain that seemed almost like icy fingers brushing against the skin. In the corner of the harbor stood a huge cargo ship. Its massive structure was an imposing presence, its rusty sides a mosaic of brown and orange hues, telling stories of countless voyages, of storms braved and ports visited. This leviathan of the sea, now anchored in stillness, seemed like a slumbering giant, a relic of times long past. Beneath the dim light of a street lamp stood a man named Jake. His figure, slightly hunched against the cold, was rendered in stark relief by the pale light. His eyes, under the brim of a weathered hat, were fixed on the ship. Jake's gaze was thoughtful, yet there was a hint of unease in it, as if he saw not just the ship but the shadow of something more sinister. His partner Ron approached him, his footsteps echoing on the damp pavement, breaking the somber silence that had enveloped Jake. Ron's breath came out in visible puffs in the cold air as he spoke. "How long have I kept you waiting?" he asked. Jake's response was a faint nod, his voice barely more than a whisper in the wind. "Not long," he said, his words carrying the weight of thought. He then asked the reason for Ron's tardiness, his tone casual but his eyes never leaving the ship. Ron, rubbing his hands together for warmth, explained about being stuck in traffic. His voice was a contrast to the hushed sounds of the harbor, lively and unconcerned. He added with a hint of intrigue, "This is the same ship that was rumored." Jake's response was a murmur, almost lost in the wind. "Yeah, there's a lot of strange stories surrounding that ship. My gut tells me something's not right," he said, his voice carrying an undercurrent of darkness, a hint of foreboding. Ron only grinned in response, a flash of white in the dim light. "You're starting with your gut again," he chided lightly. "It's just an old, forgotten ship." But his tone changed as he added, "But this is where all the threads of our investigations lead. Let's go see what it's hiding. We didn't drive all the way across town for nothing." They passed through the harbor gate, their footsteps a steady rhythm against the backdrop of the harbor's quiet. The gate itself was an old structure, its paint peeling, a silent sentinel to the comings and goings of the harbor. As they moved, Jake's mind raced with the information he had gathered about the ship. He had made some inquiries, spoken to a few old sailors and dock workers. The stories he heard were disturbing. Tales of unexplained disappearances and strange noises coming from the ship at night. It all made for dark thoughts. But they weren't here because of rumors. They were investigating. In the shadowed embrace of the harbor, Jake and Ron, a pair of seasoned trackers akin to bloodhounds in their profession, stood surveying the old ship. Their expertise, a blend of intuition and meticulous investigation, had been honed over years of tracing the steps of those who disappeared into the folds of the city. They were private detectives, yes, but their specialty lay in unraveling the threads of missing persons cases, often working alongside the police to untangle mysteries that left others confounded. Jake, the more taciturn of the duo, carried with him the history of a man once entrusted with the badge of law enforcement. His tenure as a police officer, however, was marred by controversies. Accusations of excessive force, and a propensity for drawing his weapon a tad too quickly. These shadows from his past ultimately led to his departure from the force, paving the way for his current partnership with Ron. Ron, on the other hand, was the gregarious counterpart to Jake's stoicism. His approach was less about brooding silence and more about action, sometimes bordering on the audacious. It was this blend of their contrasting styles that made them an effective team. Their current case, a puzzle involving the disappearance of 3 students, had led them to this desolate part of the city. The trail, a series of fragmented clues and whispers, had coalesced around this harbor, a place where the city's relentless energy seemed to ebb into a somber quiet. It was Ron who had unearthed a significant lead. Sneaking into the room of one of the missing students, a move that was as risky as it was necessary, he had discovered a notebook. Its pages, filled with the scrawlings of a creative mind, contained a script for a horror movie. This was not just any script. It was a narrative woven around the very ship that now stood as a silent behemoth before them. Accompanying this script were photographs, old and worn, depicting the ship in an eerie light. The realization dawned on them. These students had embarked on a venture to bring their cinematic vision to life, using the derelict ship as their backdrop. As Jake and Ron delved deeper into the night, the harbor around them seemed to resonate with a palpable sense of history. The ship, a towering structure of rusted metal and forgotten stories, seemed to beckon them, holding within its bowels the secrets of the missing students. The night air, cold and biting, carried the salty tang of the sea and the faintest echoes of the city behind them. The harbor, with its dimly lit pathways and the occasional creak of moored boats, felt like a world apart from the bustling streets they had left behind. As they approached the gangway of the ship, the sense of foreboding that had gripped Jake since he first laid eyes on the vessel intensified. The ship, now a looming presence in the darkness, seemed to hold a morbid fascination. The faint creaking of its structure, the way its silhouette cut through the night sky, all added to the eerie atmosphere. Ron, ever the pragmatist, broke the silence. "If those kids were here to shoot a horror film, they couldn't have picked a better location," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Yet, even in his light-hearted remark, there was an underlying tension, a recognition of the gravity of their task. Jake, with a history entangled in both the realms of law enforcement and private investigation, had been drawn into this case by an old acquaintance from the police force. The case, which revolved around the mysterious disappearance of 3 students, had led them to this forsaken vessel. Jake's former colleague had mentioned the police's interest in the ship, but their hands were tied. The vessel's new owner refused to let police in without a warrant, and with the ship slated for dismantling, time was a luxury they couldn't afford. This sense of urgency was what led Jake to take on the case. Yet as he stood at the threshold of the ship, a feeling of unease crept over him. The case was riddled with oddities, with questions that didn't quite add up. It was these unanswered queries that gnawed at him, like a puzzle where the pieces were there, but the picture they formed was obscured in shadows. The duo stepped onto the ship, their footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. The vessel, once a behemoth of the seas, now lay abandoned, a ghost of its former self. The air inside was heavy with the scent of rust and salt, a remnant of its days traversing the oceans. The corridors were shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from their flashlights, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Doors along the corridor told stories of neglect and decay. Some hung off their hinges, others protested with a loud creak at the slightest touch. Windows, devoid of panes, allowed the cold night air to seep in, creating an atmosphere that was as chilling as it was desolate. The ship's interior was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, each step further into its bowels, amplifying the sense of desolation. The faint sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance was a steady reminder of the ship's slow succumb to nature. The walls, lined with peeling paint and streaks of rust, bore the marks of time and neglect. Jake and Ron moved cautiously, their senses heightened in the enveloping darkness. The silence of the ship was a stark contrast to the constant din of the city, making every sound, every creak and groan of the old structure more pronounced. The darkness seemed to press in on them, tangible and heavy. As Jake and Ron ventured deeper into the labyrinthine corridors of the ship, their flashlights cutting swathes through the oppressive darkness, Jake began to unravel the vessel's enigmatic history. His voice, a steady cadence amidst the creaking silence, wove the tale of the ship's past. The ship once belonged to a major cargo company, a titan in the world of international shipments. Its purpose had been mundane, routine even, to ferry goods from far-flung exotic lands to the bustling ports of the Western world. But this ship's fate had veered sharply from the mundane into the realm of the mysterious. Jake recounted how, years ago, the ship set sail, its hull laden with goods from an unnamed exotic country. It had departed under the most ordinary of circumstances, yet shortly after leaving port, it vanished. The disappearance was not just a lapse in communication. It was as if the ship had been swallowed by the sea itself. Months passed, with the ship relegated to memory and speculation, a mere footnote in the annals of lost vessels. Then, as unexpectedly as it had disappeared, it reappeared. The ship was found drifting aimlessly close to the harbor, a ghostly apparition on the horizon. The most chilling part of the story, as Jake related, was the fate of the crew. The entire crew had vanished, their absence a gaping void in the ship's narrative. They seemed to have evaporated into thin air, leaving behind no clue, no hint of what might have befallen them. The mystery of their disappearance remained unsolved, a haunting question mark in the ship's history. As they walked, the dim light from their flashlights illuminated the walls, revealing more of the ship's eerie interior. Jake paused, his light resting on markings that marred the rusted walls, messages that told of unspeakable horrors. These messages, written in what appeared to be blood, spoke of a monster hidden within the ship, a malevolent entity lurking in its shadows. Jake explained that after the ship's mysterious reappearance, it had been subjected to exhaustive investigations. Teams of experts combed every inch of the vessel, their searches meticulous and thorough. Yet, despite their efforts, they found nothing. No trace of the crew, no hint of any monster, nothing to explain the blood-chilling messages that adorned its walls. As they delved further into the ship, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a tangible reminder of the ship's long abandonment. The silence was broken only by the echo of their footsteps and the distant groan of the sea. Jake's voice, steady and somber, narrated the next chapter of the ship's cursed existence. After its mysterious reappearance and the inexplicable disappearance of its crew, the ship was, against all odds, put back into service. The decision, marred by controversy and whispers of bad omens, was driven by the pragmatic needs of commerce. The vessel was restored and set sail once more, its hull filled with goods from distant lands. But the respite from its haunted past was short-lived. A mere month after it returned to service, tragedy struck again with an eerie echo of the past. The ship, like a phantom, vanished from all radars, its presence wiped clean from the eyes of the world. And when it reappeared, a month later, the scenario was hauntingly familiar. The crew had vanished, leaving the ship drifting like a lifeless husk. The The blood-curdling aspect of this second disappearance was the repetition of the bloody inscriptions on the walls. The messages, scrawled in desperation or madness, proclaimed that the monster was alive and that the ship was cursed. These words, a chilling echo of the past, sealed the ship's fate. It was never operated again, its story too tainted with the specter of the unknown and the unexplainable. Jake and Ron moved through the ship, their footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. As they ventured deeper, Jake spoke of the aftermath that befell the cargo company that owned the ship. The curse of the vessel seemed to spread like a malevolent shadow, touching everything associated with it. The company, once thriving in the world of maritime commerce, started experiencing a series of inexplicable misfortunes. Ships didn't vanish like the cursed vessel, but other tragedies befell them. Mechanical failures, severe storms, and lost goods became frequent, each incident a blow to the company's reputation and finances. The company's downward spiral was rapid, its misfortunes too peculiar and frequent to be mere coincidence. The strangest and most tragic twist in the tale, as Jake recounted, was the fate of the cargo company's owner. A man once renowned for his business acumen and rationality, he descended into madness, his mind consumed by the curse of the ship. It was rumored that in a fit of desperation, he ventured onto the cursed ship armed with a shotgun, intent on destroying the mythical monster he believed was the source of his woes. He, like the others before him, disappeared within the bowels of the ship, never to be seen again. In the wake of these tragedies, the cargo company crumbled, its legacy reduced to bankruptcy, and whispered tales of curses and madness. The ship, the epicenter of these misfortunes, stood abandoned in the harbor, a rusting monument to its own dark history. The decrepit vessel, a silent giant shrouded in darkness, seemed to hold its breath as Jake and Ron delved deeper into its bowels. The air was thick with the smell of rust and salt, a tangible reminder of the sea's incessant battle against the ship. Ron, ever the pragmatist, voiced his skepticism. In his experience, old ships like this one, along with abandoned houses and forgotten castles, were fertile grounds for rumors and legends. To him, the tales surrounding the ship were likely embellishments, the product of overactive imaginations and a penchant for the macabre. As they continued their exploration, the ship's walls revealed more of its chilling secrets. Bloody inscriptions, words like "cursed family" and "run," were scrawled across the corroded metal. The messages were unnerving, their presence a stark contrast to Ron's skepticism. Jake, examining the writings more closely, felt a chill run down his spine. The inscriptions were fresh, the blood still glistening in the dim light of their flashlights. The realization that they might not be alone on the ship was a jarring one. It was in this heightened state of alertness that they heard it. A noise, distant but distinct, not far from where they stood. The decision to investigate the noise was a unanimous one, born out of both necessity and a detective's inherent curiosity. As they moved towards the source of the sound, Jake inquired in a hushed tone if Ron had brought a gun. Ron's negative reply only served to heighten the tension. Jake, with a grim expression, revealed that he had brought a weapon, his instincts having warned him of potential trouble. Their progression down the ship's corridors was a cautious one, their senses attuned to every creak and groan of the old vessel. The realization that they were being followed crept up on them slowly, a growing sense of unease that turned into certainty as they heard the subtle but unmistakable sounds of footsteps mirroring their own. The corridors, with their peeling paint and rusted fixtures, seemed to stretch on endlessly, a maze of metal and shadows. The faint sounds of their pursuit were a constant companion, a reminder that they were not alone in this forsaken place. As they approached the source of the noise, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The flashlights, their beams cutting through the darkness, revealed more of the ship's decaying interior. A world frozen in time, a monument to its own dark legacy. As Jake and Ron approached the source of the sound, the noise and eerie combination of shuffling and faint footsteps suddenly stopped, plunging the ship into a silence that seemed almost suffocating. The silence was broken only by hurried movements, as if someone, perhaps several people, were running away, their footsteps echoing ghostly in the vast corridors of the ship. Despite their efforts to illuminate the darkened passages with their flashlights, Jake and Ron could discern no sign of whoever was sharing this desolate space with them. It was as if the shadows themselves were conspiring to hide the ship's secrets. As they advanced, a discovery sent a chill down their spines. Scattered in a cluttered heap were items unmistakably belonging to the missing students: sneakers, tattered clothes, backpacks, and most telling of all, a camera. The camera, a silent witness to the events that had unfolded on this cursed vessel, held the potential to unravel the mystery. With a sense of trepidation, Jake and Ron played the footage. The screen flickered to life, revealing the students in their final, carefree moments. They were jovial, their laughter echoing off the ship's walls, their demeanor nonchalant, almost boisterous. One of them, in a display of bravado, mockingly addressed the mythical monster of the ship, his voice loud and teasing. The footage showed the students moving towards the back of the ship, their laughter gradually giving way to a palpable sense of unease as they too began to hear unexplained noises. Initially startled, they pressed on, their camera capturing their journey deeper into the ship's heart. The atmosphere of the footage shifted dramatically as a scream pierced the air. One of the students had vanished. Panic set in, the camera capturing their frantic movements as they tried to find a way out, their escape thwarted by the labyrinthine layout of the ship. In the dim light of the camera, one of the students suddenly began to scream, pointing into the darkness with a terror that was visceral. The footage became chaotic, the camera jerking wildly as something emerged from the shadows. The last images were the stuff of nightmares, a glimpse of sharp fangs, the sound of desperate screams, and then darkness. Jake and Ron stood motionless, the camera's screen now blank, its last images etched in their minds. The ship, a silent behemoth around them, felt more menacing than ever, its secrets darker and more profound. The silence that enveloped them was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a presence, oppressive and foreboding. Jake and Ron came to a grim realization. The situation, with its growing horrors and the palpable sense of a malevolent presence, was beyond their capacity to handle alone. Deciding to retreat and call for reinforcements, they turned to leave the ship. But the ship, like a maze designed to trap unwary souls, did not relinquish its hold easily. As they attempted to navigate their way back, the noises around them intensified. The thuds and scrapes, once distant and ambiguous, now sounded like the deliberate movements of a predator closing in on its prey. The monster, a sinister shadow within the ship's dark corridors, seemed to be stalking them. Panic, a visceral and primal force, began to take hold as they found themselves unable to find a way out. The ship's interior, a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, seemed to shift and change around them, a maze with no discernible exit. In this heightened state of terror, they suddenly stumbled upon a huge, dark figure looming in the hallway. Instinctively, Jake fired his gun at the shadowy form, and they ran, their footsteps echoing in the claustrophobic confines of the ship. Their flight from the monster led them, by chance or fate, into a strange room. The room, a stark contrast to the rest of the ship, was furnished with several mattresses, scattered children's toys, and traces of dog hair, remnants of life in a place that seemed to have forgotten what living meant. It was in this surreal setting that they encountered an unexpected inhabitant of the ship, a gaunt, gray-haired old man with hands that trembled like leaves in a storm. The old man's eyes, clouded by years of darkness, barely registered their presence. His voice, when he tried to speak, was nothing more than a hoarse, unintelligible whisper, the product of years of isolation and silence. In the room, amidst the detritus of a life lived in the shadows, Jake noticed a photograph. It depicted a young man, his features stark in the clarity of youth, standing next to a tall, tanned woman whose origins seemed to be of native descent. The image, a frozen moment in time, seemed out of place in the desolate room. Realizing the impossibility of deciphering the old man's identity in their current predicament, Jake and Ron made a decision. Despite the unknowns and the lurking danger, they could not leave the old man in this forsaken place. He needed to be rescued, brought back into the light and warmth of the world outside the ship's oppressive walls. The ship, a floating tomb of metal and shadows, seemed to resonate with the silent steps of the monster prowling its corridors. Jake, Ron, and the old man made their way through the labyrinthine passageways, the oppressive darkness around them occasionally pierced by the beam of their flashlights. As they walked, Jake broke the heavy silence with a revelation that cast a new light on the grim narrative of the ship. He spoke of a report he had read, an account from an accountant of the bankrupt cargo company. This piece of information, previously a mere footnote in the larger mystery, now took center stage in Jake's theory. The accountant's statement revealed that during the ship's first disappearance, the son of the cargo company's owner had been on board. The owner's deep concern for his missing son was well known, but what happened after the ship reappeared was shrouded in secrecy. The owner was among the first to inspect the vessel upon its return. His subsequent actions, forbidding further surveys of the ship and declaring it free of any anomalies, were actions shrouded in desperation and denial. Jake recounted the accountant's recollection of the company owner's downward spiral. As the company faced repeated tragedies, the owner, in a drunken stupor, had locked himself in his office, ranting about his son being the cause of all his misfortunes. The climax of his madness was a fateful decision. Armed with a shotgun, he had stormed off to the ship, determined to confront his son. The conclusion Jake drew from these pieces of information was chilling in its implications. The old man they had found, frail and nearly blind, was likely the owner of the cargo company, a man broken by grief and madness, and the monster that stalked the ship's corridors. It wasn't hard to guess that it was his son, transformed into something unrecognizable by whatever dark forces the ship harbored. The atmosphere in the ship seemed to thicken with this revelation, the shadows around them appearing more menacing, as if they were aware of the story being told. The old man, a silent figure shrouded in mystery, seemed even more pitiable, a tragic character in a tale of loss and madness. As they continued their journey through the ship, the sounds of the monster's movements became more pronounced, a constant reminder of the imminent danger they faced. Ron, despite his inherent skepticism, found himself unable to refute Jake's grim hypothesis. The events of the night, each more surreal and terrifying than the last, had eroded his belief in the purely rational. As they navigated the labyrinthine passageways, their journey took an even more harrowing turn. The bloodhounds, Jake and Ron, came face to face with the monstrous entity they had been dreading. Its presence was overwhelming, a shadowy figure of nightmare and legend made flesh. In a frantic bid for survival, they made the heart-wrenching decision to leave the old man behind, focusing solely on their desperate escape. Their flight towards the exit, a race against an unimaginable horror, was abruptly halted. Another monstrous figure emerged, blocking their path to freedom. The realization that they were dealing with not one, but two of these creatures hit them with the force of a physical blow. They were trapped, their fate sealed in the bowels of this cursed vessel. In a futile attempt to defend themselves, Jake fired his gun at the looming beasts. The bullets, however, were rendered useless against the thick hide and fur of the monsters. The werewolves, as they now realized these creatures to be, were impervious to their desperate efforts. The final moments of the bloodhounds were marked by screams of pain and terror. Overpowered by the werewolves' ferocity and strength, they fell victim to the creatures' deadly claws, their lives ending in a maelstrom of violence and fear. The ship, a silent observer to this gruesome scene, seemed to absorb their final cries into its very walls. After the werewolves had dispatched Jake and Ron, one of the creatures returned to the old man. Instead of exhibiting the same ferocity, this werewolf displayed an unexpected gentleness. It carefully picked up the old man, cradling him with a tenderness that was starkly at odds with the violence it had just unleashed. Carrying him back to the room from which they had taken him, the werewolf spoke in a human tongue, its voice a strange mixture of beast and man. "Father, watch over the children while we divide the spoils," it said. The old man, far from being afraid, smiled and nodded in agreement, his expression one of understanding and acceptance. As the werewolf left the room, several children emerged from the shadows. Some bore the appearance of young werewolves, while others looked like normal children. They gathered around the old man, who embraced them with open arms. His face lit up with a smile, and he made a joyful, quacking sound, a stark contrast to the darkness that surrounded them.
Story 2.
It all began on one of those frosty morning hours when winter still holds the world under its cold dominion, yet the premonition of spring could already be felt. I woke up not to the alarm, which for many mornings in a row mercilessly tore me away from the embrace of sleep, but to an unusual sound for our quiet neighborhood. It was the hum of a truck, stopping on the street right in front of my house. Unable to resist curiosity, I left the warmth of my bed to unravel the mystery of this morning visitor. From the bed, I rolled onto my feet, rubbing my eyes out of habit, and approached the window. Rays of morning light penetrated through the blinds, softly illuminating the room, creating a sense of coziness and warmth even on these frosty days. Outside, our neighborhood unfolded, which always seemed to me like a small island of comfort and tranquility amidst the noisy and bustling city. The narrow streets along which houses were built reminded of times long past when construction was carried out not for practicality, but for beauty and comfort. The trees, though bare, waiting for their time to bloom, added a picturesque quality to the landscape. The sky was gray, as is often the case in winter, but the air was surprisingly fresh and clean, as it only happens in those rare moments when winter momentarily forgets about its severity. Opposite my house was the one that had been vacant for a long time. The previous neighbors were not just residents across the way, they were part of our small community. They had a knack for gathering people around them, creating an atmosphere of hospitality and warmth. Their parties, which the entire neighborhood attended, became legendary, and their involvement in community life left no one indifferent. When they moved out, it seemed something was lost in our neighborhood, leaving behind a sense of emptiness. And now, after almost half a year, I watched the new neighbor, who seemed to have come to fill this void. Tall and muscular, his appearance could not go unnoticed. Apparently, he was a man accustomed to physical labor, perhaps even finding pleasure in it. His age, which I estimated to be over 40, gave him an appearance of maturity, experience, and confidence. His clothing, practical and unassuming, suggested that he does not seek to stand out, but rather simply lives his life. I lingered at the window, lost in thought about how our small community would change with the arrival of this new person. Was he a family man? Did he enjoy hosting parties, or did he prefer solitude? Several questions swirled in my mind, but I decided not to rush things. Time would reveal who he was and his story. Returning to my morning routines, I prepared my coffee with a different sentiment, pondering the day ahead. The new neighbor had introduced a note of intrigue into the usual order of our lives, and I looked forward to seeing how events would unfold. As you may have gathered, I am a very observant person. My observance has always been part of my essence, the ability to see beyond surface details to the deep traits of human character. It has helped me not only in personal relationships, but also in the professional realm. The skill to analyze colleagues' behavior, predict their reactions, and find an approach to a variety of personalities gave me an edge in interactions and helped establish connections that were not just useful, but enriched my life. There was never a shortage of friends in my circle, and I sincerely believed that the more, the better. However, despite my attentiveness to people's behavior, I overlooked the strange events that began to unfold around me. Perhaps this was because the last few months had been consumed by work. Days merged into a continuous sequence of deadlines and tasks requiring immediate resolution. Reports for the previous months, market analysis, budget planning for the upcoming period. All of it weighed heavily on my shoulders, leaving no time for rest or contemplation. I forgot about eating, sleeping, and even simple human joys like socializing with friends. By the end of February, my capacity for work had reached its limit. Headaches became my constant companions, a reminder that a person cannot work endlessly without rest. And on one such evening, when my head was splitting with pain, I decided to step out onto the porch of my house to breathe in some fresh air. The air was cool but not cold, with a light harbinger of spring already beginning to awaken in the earth and air. The stars twinkled in the sky, creating an illusion of calm and serenity. I took a deep breath, trying to free my mind from the incessant stream of thoughts about work. At that moment, my attention was drawn to something strange in the house opposite. At first, I thought my eyes were deceiving me due to fatigue. But as I focused my gaze, I saw that in one of the windows facing me, there were intermittent flashes of light. These flashes were irregular and brief, as if someone was turning the light on and off in the room with unpredictable frequency. Each time the light flashed, it revealed a tall figure standing by the window. It was my new neighbor, and his appearance in such a strange and motionless pose evoked in me a mix of curiosity and undefined fear. His hands were lowered along his body, and he stood absolutely still, as if he were part of an exhibition in a wax museum. But the strangest was his behavior. At one moment, he would start to rapidly and jerkily turn his head from side to side, as if trying to catch something in the darkness of the night, or as though he was in a state of extreme agitation or fright. This scene froze me in place, forgetting about the cold that had previously penetrated my clothes and the headache that had tormented me just moments ago. I became a witness to something incredible and at the same time terrifying. Suddenly, as if sensing my gaze, the figure stopped and slowly turned its face towards the window. What I saw next exceeded all my expectations for the night. Although the distance between our houses was significant, and the night hid most details, I could swear that at that moment, my neighbor's eyes glowed in the dark, like two bright headlights. This light seemed unnatural, inhuman. He was not just looking in my direction. He was looking right at me. The gaze was so intense and piercing that it seemed as if he could see me through the walls and the distance separating our houses. I stood, rooted to the spot, unable to tear myself away from this spectacle, until the light in his window finally went out, leaving me in indecision and confusion. My heart pounded in my ears, and my mind tried to find a logical explanation for what I had seen. Questions swirled in my head. What was that? Why was my neighbor behaving so strangely? And most importantly, what did his gaze mean? Admitting to my fear did not come easily to me. I had always considered myself to be steadfast and decisive, but that night showed me that even the most confident among us are not immune to the terror of the unknown. Returning inside, I felt my muscles tense, and a whirlwind of thoughts and speculations about what could have happened in the neighboring house began to swirl in my head. The night, which had previously seemed an oasis of silence and peace, suddenly transformed into an arena of my inner struggles and fears. I felt like a participant in something inexplicable, and this feeling would not let me rest. Trying to muster courage, I turned off the light in my room to once again look at the house opposite through the darkness of the night, hoping that the light anomalies had disappeared and everything had returned to its normal state. Standing by the window in complete darkness, I strained my eyes trying to discern any details in the black outline of the house opposite. The light show that had captured my attention just minutes before had indeed stopped. Complete darkness reigned outside the windows, and no signs of life were observable. This observation brought me some relief, and I was able to take a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. That night, sleep was hard to come by. Thoughts about my neighbor's strange behavior and the mysterious light effects in his house prevented me from relaxing. However, lying in bed and staring into the darkness, I made a decision. I resolved not to jump to any hasty conclusions about what had happened. After all, it was entirely possible that there was a logical and simple explanation for all this, which I could only find out by talking to the neighbor. I decided that the next day I would try to meet him, to introduce myself, and perhaps subtly bring up the topic of the previous night. Maybe this would allow me to find answers to the questions that had been troubling me and dispel my fears. This decision gave me confidence, and I gradually began to calm down, allowing fatigue to take over and carry me into the realm of sleep. The next day, gathering my courage and reminding myself of the importance of personal interaction to dispel doubts and fears, I made my way to my neighbor's house. All the events of the previous night now seemed like a distant and not so terrifying dream, but echoes of past fear still resonated within me as a quiet echo. A feeling of unease had been replaced by a strange nausea, and my appetite had vanished, leaving me in a state of slight disorientation. Reaching my neighbor's door, I paused for a moment, trying to collect my thoughts and calm my racing heart. Taking a deep breath, I knocked. The sounds of my knocks seemed exceptionally loud in the quiet of the morning. Footsteps from inside the house made my heart beat even faster. With each approaching step, I felt the tension within me build, despite my attempts to convince myself otherwise. When the door finally opened, I found myself face to face with the tall, muscular man I had already formed an opinion of based on his appearance and the strange events of the previous night. A look of mild surprise crossed his face at my unexpected visit. I introduced myself, trying to hide my nervousness and inner tension. To my surprise, the neighbor turned out to be extremely friendly and welcoming. He not only warmly invited me in, but also offered me tea, thus creating an atmosphere of warmth and hospitality in his home. Inside, his dwelling was cozy and spacious, with a pleasant interior that spoke of the owner's good taste. During our conversation, which unfolded over cups of aromatic tea, the neighbor told me about himself. He indeed was an engineer working for one of the major private companies. This conversation allowed me to view my neighbor in a new light. All his words and behavior dissipated my initial fears and prejudices. As our dialogue developed, I gradually began to feel more relaxed and confident. The nausea and nervousness that had accompanied me on my way to his house slowly gave way to curiosity and interest in his personality and life. As our interaction continued, I discovered even more remarkable qualities in my new neighbor. His talkativeness was infectious, and soon we moved from simple greetings to deeper and more meaningful topics. Our discussion ranged from everyday matters to complex engineering problems, allowing me to see the breadth of his interests and knowledge. He was not only tall and muscular, but also possessed an intellect that instantly commanded my respect. In his presence, I felt somewhat diminished, not just physically, but also because of the depth of his knowledge and experience. However, this feeling was more motivating than oppressive. His ease of communication and openness made our dialogue pleasant and effortless, despite the nervousness and bias I had brought with me. After the conversation had moved far beyond my initial assumptions about his character, I finally found the courage to ask about the events of the previous night. His reaction to my question was instantaneous, a surprise that flickered in his eyes which seemed sincere to me. However, his explanation that he often trains at night seemed perfectly logical to me. After all, who was I to judge someone's habits or hobbies, even if they appeared somewhat unusual? Leaving his house, I felt a sense of lightness and satisfaction for having taken this step. Getting to know my neighbor not only dispelled my own doubts and fears, but also broadened my circle of acquaintances. We parted with warm smiles and a promise to talk again. As I walked home, I reflected on how easily we can create prejudices about people based on limited information or external manifestations, without trying to delve deeper. I thought to myself, people can be different, and just because he trains deep into the night doesn't mean he's some kind of oddity to worry about. However, at the time, I didn't realize just how profoundly I was actually mistaken. Returning home after meeting with my neighbor, I felt a surge of energy and inspiration for work. This feeling helped me to focus and complete one of the most important and challenging tasks, the annual report. Work consumed me entirely, and only late in the evening did I finally send the completed document to management. I felt the tension of many days leave my shoulders, giving way to a sense of completion and satisfaction. Calm and tired, I went to sleep, expecting the night to bring me well-deserved rest. However, peace was short-lived. That night, I was visited by a nightmare so vivid and alive that its echo stayed with me even after waking. In the dream, I found myself in an unknown and gloomy place, where a tense and anxious atmosphere reigned. My new neighbor appeared in the dream not alone, but accompanied by a huge dog of a gray, ashen color, which resembled more a wolf than a dog. In the dream, my reality was distorted. The world around me was warped and incomprehensible, and space seemed both infinite and enclosed at the same time. The neighbor and his companion began a pursuit that quickly turned into a hunt for me. I tried to run away, but my movements seemed slowed, as if I were running through a thick, viscous liquid. The harder I tried to speed up, the more immobilized I felt. The neighbor and his beast alternated between human and wolf forms, creating a sense of chaos and uncertainty. Their faces and shapes blurred, transitioning from one image to another in the shimmering mist of my nightmare. They came closer and closer, their steps becoming more distinct, their breathing more audible. The apex of fear came when I found myself on the edge of a bottomless pit. Looking back and seeing my pursuers approaching, I lost my balance and fell into the abyss. The wind whistled in my ears, and the darkness around me became thicker and thicker. The fall seemed eternal. I plummeted downwards, engulfed by a sense of absolute terror and despair. The fear of the unknown and the anticipation of the inevitable impact with the ground filled every second of the fall. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. For a moment, I felt as though I was still falling, unable to understand where I was or what had happened. Breathing was difficult, as if someone was squeezing my chest. The room seemed foreign, and the darkness around threatening. It took me some time to calm down, collect my thoughts, and remember that I was in my own bed, in my own house, and that the horror I had just experienced was only a dream. I sat up, pressing a hand to my chest, trying to calm my racing heart. After calming down, the decision to drink water seemed like the best way to restore my internal equilibrium. The thought that all the experiences were merely the result of stress and lack of sleep seemed reasonable. However, despite these attempts at self-reassurance, a sense of unease lingered in the air like fog, unwilling to dissipate. In the kitchen, standing in front of the sink and filling a glass with water, I mechanically turned to the window. My gaze involuntarily drifted towards my neighbor's house, where the same flickering light flashed in the darkness again. This time, no one was visible outside the window, which only heightened the sense of uncertainty. However, straining my eyes, I noticed the silhouette of my neighbor in the darkness near his house. He stood, resembling a huge, menacing shadow, motionless except for his head, which jerkily moved from side to side. And suddenly, as if sensing my gaze, he froze and looked straight at me. Even through the distance and darkness, I felt that he saw me as clearly as I saw him. Unable to tear myself away from this spectacle, I tried to understand what was happening. At that moment, the tense silence was shattered by a sharp ring of the phone. I flinched, and the glass of water slipped from my hands, shattering on the floor. The sound of breaking glass echoed in the silence of the kitchen, water spreading in all directions, soaking the floor. But I barely noticed it, hurrying to answer the call. My heart raced in anticipation of something unknown as I picked up the receiver. However, I heard nothing but silence. My heart raced anxiously, and trying to overcome the sudden surge of anxiety, I loudly asked into the phone, "Who is calling me at night?" hoping to hear a response. But instead, a beast's deep growl followed. My imagination, already stirred by the recent nightmare, instantly painted a picture in my mind of a dog or wolf lurking in the shadows. I hastily fell silent, turned off the phone, and trying to compose myself, approached the window again. I found the street empty. Neither the neighbor nor his ominous shadow remained. Only emptiness and the night, which seemed to have become even deeper and darker. A sense of unease enveloped me, chilling me and making me doubt my own safety even within my home. I tried to gather my thoughts. What was that? A coincidence or a warning? My heart pounded wildly, and my mind refused to accept what had happened as reality. But the more I thought, the colder the grip of incomprehension and fear of the unknown that the night harbored wrapped around me. After a night full of anxiety and restlessness, I concluded that before taking any decisive steps, I should observe my neighbor's behavior more closely. Perhaps my fears and the entire atmosphere of mystery that surrounded me were merely the product of my overactive imagination, Despite feeling tired from the sleepless night, I went to work, trying to give my day the usual rhythm and order. The office, usually perceived as a familiar and routine place, felt foreign and even hostile that day. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. This sense of being followed lingered, creating the illusion that my neighbor was somewhere nearby, that he stood around every corner, invisibly observing me. Every rustle, every unexpected sound made me start and turn around, trying to catch an elusive presence. Goosebumps ran down my spine at the thought that my suspicions could be reality, that I was indeed under constant surveillance. From time to time, I raised my eyes, scanning the faces of colleagues passing by. The workday turned into an ordeal. Attempts to distract myself and immerse in usual tasks failed one after another. My thoughts were far away outside the office, swirling around the inexplicable and unsettling. Each time I lifted my gaze from the computer monitor, it seemed I might catch a shadow or reflection of my neighbor's figure. But each time it was just a figment of my imagination. Lunch break brought no relief. Sitting alone at a table in the cafeteria, I felt even more vulnerable. All the surrounding glances seemed evaluating, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. This feeling continued to grow, turning every minute spent in the office into a trial. Returning to my workstation, I tried to focus on the upcoming tasks, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I caught myself checking my mail and social networks, not so much out of professional necessity, but in the hope of not finding anything related to him. My attempts to delve into work were interrupted by sudden surges of anxiety, and I repeatedly found my gaze slipping to the window, checking if someone was there watching me. By the end of the workday, my state of tension had peaked. I barely restrained the urge to constantly look back as I left the office. The way home turned into a marathon of obstacles, where every shadow seemed ominous, and every random glance from passers-by felt like his gaze. At home, within the relative safety of my own walls, I allowed myself to relax a bit. But the feeling that I had become the object of attention, of someone's invisible presence, did not leave me. It was hard to admit, but I realized that this story with my neighbor was affecting me more than I could have imagined. Gradually, I felt my thoughts slipping into the abyss of paranoia. It was inevitable, as if I were dragging myself down into a deep, dark well, where rational doubts mixed with irrational fear. Perhaps I had become the architect of this prison, building walls out of guesses and assumptions about a neighbor who might have been just an ordinary person. Yet something inside me screamed that my safety was hanging by a thread. That day, I acted on a survival instinct. I locked the door with all the locks and left a baseball bat next to my bed. This decision brought mixed feelings within me. On one hand, laughter at the absurdity the situation had reached, and on the other, sadness from realizing that my actions could be futile in the face of a real threat. Could I really use the baseball bat? Would I have enough strength and courage? These questions circled in my mind, reminding me of my own doubts about my ability to protect myself if a real threat arose. As the sky began to paint itself with the colors of sunset, turning day into evening, my anxiety reached its peak. I felt like a beast trapped in a cage of my own fears, unable to tear myself away from the window through which the world outside seemed both familiar and alien. Twilight, in my perception, has always been a time of change, when day gives way to night and reality to shadows and doubts. This evening, they took on an especially troubling hue. I stood by the window, my eyes unconsciously scanning the street until they rested on the figure of my neighbor. His appearance was sudden, as if he had emerged from the very essence of the sunset, blending with the soft shadows of the evening light. Next to him walked a dog, precisely the one that had appeared in my nightmares. This vision struck me, causing an instant paralysis. Gray, powerful, it moved with the same unflappability as its owner. My breath halted when the neighbor suddenly stopped and turned his face towards me. It seemed he felt that I was watching him. That moment felt like an eternity, in which I was completely exposed to his gaze. He waved at me. His smile was calm and it seemed friendly, but that smile did not reach his eyes, in which I read an unfathomable depth. The dog, however, continued to look at me motionlessly. Its gaze was incredibly focused and sharp, as if it was not an animal, but a sentient being. I jumped back from the window as if stung. Alarming thoughts about truly becoming the object of someone's heightened interest echoed in my mind. Questions cascaded one after another. Why did he look at me that way? What did his greeting mean? And what about the dog? A simple coincidence or something more? My heart pounded wildly, and my hands shook involuntarily. I realized that my safety was something I needed to care for, not just in dreams, but in reality as well. The baseball bat by the bed suddenly didn't seem such an ironic precaution anymore. Deep down, I began to understand that the line between reality and paranoia was becoming thinner with every glance towards that house, with every rustle of the evening wind. Lying in my bed, I felt anxiety and fear fill every corner of my room, making the air dense and heavy to breathe. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, where darkness merged with the flickering light of street lamps penetrating through the curtains. In my imagination, scenarios of what could happen alternated with cinematic speed. I envisioned approaching the phone, dialing the police and trying to explain my situation. But what would I say? Listen, there's a creepy neighbor living next to me with a scary dog. They haven't done anything to me, but they scare me to death. Help me. In my mind's eye, I saw skeptical looks, heard skeptical questions, and felt even more alone and unprotected. How can they understand? I asked myself. How can I explain the inexpressible? Something I barely understand myself. The hours relentlessly passed, and my anxiety grew like a flame in a windless night. I would jump out of bed, approach the window, draw back the curtain, and try to discern anything in the darkness. But the street was empty. Only the light from the lamps cast strange shadows on the asphalt, which my imagination turned into new threats. It seemed that the night would never end. My attempts to fall asleep were in vain. Every time I was on the verge of sleep, my mind returned to the same anxious thoughts. They swirled in my head like a whirlwind, carrying me further away from peace and tranquility. And yet, despite all this inner turmoil, fatigue eventually took over. I fell asleep, but my sleep was troubled and full of restless visions. I dreamt I was in a deep, narrow tunnel where the light was only a faint flicker in the distance. The dream felt so realistic that the line between reality and fiction seemed blurred. The air here was heavy and cold. With each breath, I felt the cold penetrate my lungs, causing discomfort and anxiety. The tunnel walls seemed damp and slippery to the touch when I instinctively reached out, trying to find support or at least understand what they were made of. My neighbor, in the dream, took on even more terrifying features. He chased me with his dog, which seemed to transform back and forth between a huge wolf and its normal appearance. The escape through the tunnel seemed endless. I tried to reach the light at its end, but with every step, the exit seemed further and further away. This strange effect made me feel hopeless, as if I had fallen into a trap with no escape. The steps behind me grew louder, and the growling and howling of the wolf filled the tunnel space, inducing panic fear in me. The cries for help I uttered seemed soundless. My words dissolved into the darkness, finding no response. This amplified the feeling of loneliness and despair. My attempts to escape my pursuers became more desperate, but the tunnel seemed to mock me, stretching further and further. And when I felt that my strength was leaving me, and my pursuers were about to catch up with me, I realized that it was all just a dream. With this realization came the desire to wake up, which I felt with my entire being. The struggle to awaken was hard, but eventually, I managed to open my eyes. In the first moments, I couldn't understand whether the nightmare was continuing or if I was already safe in my bedroom. My breathing was heavy and ragged. My heart pounded so hard that its beats echoed in my ears. I lay still for a few seconds, trying to orient myself in reality. Gradually, as the initial panic began to subside, I felt a strange and anxious premonition. My bedroom suddenly seemed foreign and hostile. The darkness in the corners of the room appeared denser than usual, and I felt utterly vulnerable in the face of an unknown threat. I felt I was not alone. And then, my heart froze in terror when I suddenly realized that the silhouette at the head of my bed was not a figment of my imagination. It was him, my neighbor, standing beside me with his dog, smiling. But he was not as I had seen him before. His appearance was distorted in my eyes. Tall, muscular, covered in fur, with eyes burning with a predatory fire. At that moment, he was not just a man. He appeared before me as a creature from my worst nightmare. Fear paralyzed me so much that I couldn't make the slightest movement. A scream stuck in my throat, and only fragmented thoughts of how to protect myself, what to do next, flashed through my mind. The moment seemed to stretch into eternity, until I realized that my only defense was action. With trembling hands, I turned on the light. The distortion of reality disappeared, and the room appeared empty before me. There was no werewolf neighbor, no frightening dog. Only I was there, drenched in sweat that had seized my body, and the bat lying next to the bed, a reminder that the fear had real grounds. Breathing gradually became smoother, but the anxiety did not disappear. It was with me, in my room, in my house, in my consciousness. With every step down the stairs, my heart pounded louder and louder, as if trying to burst out of my chest. Thoughts whirled chaotically in my head, but one stood out more brightly than the rest. I need to call the police. At that moment, I didn't think about the rationality of my actions. The fear I experienced was too real to ignore. Whether it was a continuation of my nightmare or the neighbor had actually infiltrated my home no longer mattered. I felt I was on the verge between sanity and madness, where every decision seemed both right and absurd. I stopped in the middle of the living room, feeling cold drafts glide over my skin. The darkness outside the window seemed almost physically tangible, and the silence in the house suddenly filled with thousands of invisible eyes watching me. I wanted to scream, to break through this veil of ignorance and fear, but I understood that my cry would drown in this bottomless silence, finding no response. The thought of calling the police fluttered in my head, like a moth around a lamp. But every time I was ready to pick up the phone, the thought of how it would look to others stopped me. How to explain that your fears stem from a dream in which your neighbor turns into a werewolf? It seemed that even attempting to articulate this aloud sounded like madness. And what would they say if I admitted that it seemed this nightmare had penetrated my reality? Even I couldn't be 100% sure of it. Enough, echoed in my head. I was certain it was time to end this mad game of fear and uncertainty. Step by step, I approached the phone, each movement filled with the resolve to inform the police about everything happening. My hand was ready to grab the receiver when it suddenly came to life in my hands, ringing so unexpectedly that I nearly dropped it from the shock. The call sounded like thunder on a clear day, making my heart freeze in fear. Initially, I didn't even want to pick up the receiver, but the ringing persisted, becoming more insistent and demanding with each tone. Finally, gathering my courage, I cautiously lifted the receiver. The voice that answered was rough and low, more like a growl than human speech. "Oops, I'm already here." These words, accompanied by demonic laughter, pierced through me, pushing my internal tension to the limit. Thoughts started racing through my head. What to do? How to protect myself? Where to run? My attention was so focused on the sounds coming from the phone that I didn't notice the subtle rustling behind me that infiltrated the room's space. When I finally heard it, my heart skipped a beat. I whirled around, swinging the bat with all my might, ready to fend off an invisible enemy. But there was no one. Only the emptiness of the room stared back at me, as if mocking my fears. The silence that followed seemed even louder and more threatening than all the sounds that had filled my house before. I stood in the middle of the living room, holding the bat, feeling bewildered. The air in the house vibrated with an invisible presence, so tangible it felt as though I could touch it by reaching out my hand. With each step I took, trying to move away from the phone, the sense of my neighbor's proximity became stronger. My imagination painted his figure in every shadow around every corner, as if he was indeed everywhere and nowhere at the same time. My breath halted in my chest at the thought that he might suddenly appear before me, and I wouldn't even have time to react. When a growl similar to the sound made by a beast from the depths of my nightmares suddenly filled the air, my body acted on autopilot. The decision to run to the basement came instinctively, as if the deeper layers of my consciousness knew that only there would I find refuge. I dashed through the house, pursued, my heart beating in time with my steps, and fear overshadowing everything else. Passing by the kitchen, I saw it. The large gray dog, which seemed to have grown out of the night itself to become the guardian of my flight. It sat motionless, like a statue, and its eyes followed me, full of unfathomable knowledge. That moment froze in time. The fear I felt was so powerful that my legs nearly failed me. But the instinct for self-preservation proved stronger, and I threw the bat towards the dog, rushing to the saving darkness of the basement. As I descended the stairs, it seemed the neighbor, no, the werewolf, was breathing down my neck. I felt something cold glide over my skin before I slammed the basement door behind me. My heart pounded wildly as I gasped for air. I immediately began to barricade the door with boxes. Every movement was filled with wild, animalistic fear and determination not to let the horror enter. The darkness in the basement was absolute. I stood there, enveloped in darkness, trying to calm the frantic rhythm of my heart. I realized this was only a temporary refuge, but at the same time I saw no other way out. My mind buzzed with questions about what to do next, how to survive the night, and what awaited me beyond the basement door when I finally dared to open it. My lungs constricted with every heavy breath, the air seeming saturated with despair. Sweat ran down my face, merging with the drops that had long soaked my clothes. My legs trembled not so much from fatigue as from the relentless tension I had been in for an unknown amount of time. Seconds dragged slowly, turning into minutes, which in turn seemed an eternity to me. I expected the basement door to start creaking under the pressure of my elusive pursuer, but nothing happened. No sound of footsteps, not a single rustle. Absolute silence enveloped me, creating the illusion that I was outside of time and space. All my fears, all the tension, seemed to reach its peak when I heard his whisper. It was so unexpected that I jumped as if shocked. "See you soon." These words sounded right in my head, as if the neighbor had found a way to infiltrate my most secret thoughts. This moment became the culmination of my horror. At the moment when I had started to think that maybe all this was just the fruit of my overactive imagination, the whisper sounded like a verdict. My fears were confirmed, and I realized that fleeing to the basement was not a solution to the problem. I sat in the darkness, trying to gather my thoughts and emotions. The basement, which seemed to me the last refuge, now rather resembled a prison cell. I understood that sooner or later, I would have to get out. But how? Every cell of my body resisted this thought, anticipating new fears that awaited me outside. After an endlessly long night spent in the basement, surrounded by darkness and my own fears, the first rays of morning seemed like salvation. With difficulty, gathering the remnants of my will, I finally moved the boxes and slowly opened the door, ready to face new challenges. Emerging from the basement, I felt relief at having freed myself from its oppressive walls. But the apprehension of the upcoming meeting with the police did not leave me. With each step towards the nearest police station, I mulled over how to explain everything that had happened. My thoughts were confused, and I could hardly concentrate on how to present my story plausibly and coherently. It seemed to me they wouldn't believe, but I knew I had to tell about the neighbor who had invaded my living space. As the police began to search the neighbor's house, I watched from afar as other residents of our area gathered around. They looked on with bewilderment and curiosity, not understanding the reason for such attention from law enforcement to what seemed like a normal house. I tried to explain to them that all this was because of the new neighbor, who had brought so much anxiety and fear into my life. But the responses from some of the neighbors stopped me in my tracks. "No one ever moved into that house. The old neighbors haven't sold it yet. It's still up for sale." These words sounded to me like a verdict. Everything I had experienced, all my fears and emotions, moments of horror and despair, all of it instantly brought me to a standstill. So, the new neighbor never existed. There was no man or werewolf who had burst into my world, turning it upside down. How could it be that my nightmare, my encounters, and even pursuits were merely the fruit of my imagination? Or was everything I saw and heard real?
Story 3.
When I first laid eyes on the monolithic structure known as Fort Harrison Penitentiary, my heart plummeted. I had braced myself for the harsh realities of prison life. Unforgiving iron bars, the ceaseless drone of discontent, and the authoritative gaze of those who commanded the halls. Yet the very sight of Fort Harrison, a blend of concrete, brick, and weathered steel, struck a chord deep within me. An unshakable chill wrapped around me as I took in its daunting presence. My name is Alex Carter, the latest addition to the ranks of guards at Fort Harrison. My journey here was not one born out of a long-held desire to uphold the law within the confines of iron walls, but rather a twist of fate. Fort Harrison, with its infamous reputation for housing the most hardened criminals, seemed to be part of another world. Yet nothing could have prepared me for the reality of its grim facade. My first encounter with Warden Jameson was as foreboding as the walls of the prison itself. The man was a figure of discipline, his physique lean and taut, a testament to years of rigorous adherence to a regimented lifestyle. The skin on his face, etched with lines of determination and years of overseeing the unruly elements within these walls, was like a map of his experiences. His eyes were a cold, piercing blue. Standing before him, I couldn't help but feel diminished, a novice about to embark on a journey for which I was ill-prepared. Warden Jameson's briefing was succinct, each word delivered with precision. He outlined my duties with an expectation of compliance that left no room for doubt. The handshake that sealed my initiation was firm, his grip unyielding, further reinforcing the seriousness of the commitment I had just undertaken. Upon my arrival, the other guards introduced themselves with nods or brief handshakes, their expressions guarded. These were men sculpted by the relentless conditions of Fort Harrison Penitentiary, their demeanors as cold as the steel bars they patrolled beside. Unlike the vibrant camaraderie found in other professions, here there was a palpable sense of solemnity. A brotherhood born not of shared joys, but of collective endurance. The prison itself was a labyrinth of corridors and cells, its architecture designed not just to confine, but to intimidate. The walls, a patchwork of concrete and brick, bore the scars of attempts at escape and rebellion. Fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own volition. Each section of the penitentiary had its own eerie character. From the solitary confinement wing, where the silence was suffocating, to the common areas, where the air buzzed with the undercurrents of unspoken tensions. Within the ranks of guards, distinct personalities emerged, each shaped by the relentless demands of Fort Harrison. Michael was known for his humor, a rare commodity in the dim corridors of the prison. It was as straightforward as the meals served in the mess hall. Rodriguez had earned a reputation for his observant nature. Nothing escaped his attention, from the subtle shifts in a prisoner's demeanor to the slightest irregularity during a cell check. Thompson, on the other hand, was the quiet type, his silence not a sign of disinterest, but of deep understanding. He seemed to intuitively grasp the complex dynamics of prison life, navigating his duties with a calm precision. The prisoners, on the other hand, were shadows of the individuals they once were. Their movements were measured, their interactions cautious. This was a stark contrast to my previous post, where the cacophony of voices never ceased. Here the silence was a language of its own, a medium through which fear and resignation flowed freely. Even the most notorious inmates, those whose reputations had preceded them, seemed diminished under the weight of the oppressive atmosphere. Warden David's office was a stark reflection of the man himself, precise, orderly, and unnervingly silent. The desk, a large, imposing piece of dark wood, bore nothing but the essentials: a computer, a lamp, and a stack of files, all arranged with geometric precision. The shelves that lined the walls were filled with books that seemed more decorative than read, their spines uncracked and aligned perfectly. The only personal item was a vintage clock, its ticking a constant, almost accusing presence in the room. It was during these late-night walks that I felt a glimpse into the warden's world. The corridors, dimly lit and endlessly long, seemed to transform under his footsteps. I once followed at a distance, my curiosity getting the better of me. He moved with a purpose, stopping before certain cells, laying a hand on the cold stone, and whispering words too low for me to catch. His face, usually so impassive, seemed drawn, the lines deeper, and his brows furrowed in concentration. The guards, for their part, were an enigma of their own. Conversations ceased or switched to mundane topics upon my approach, their smiles tight-lipped and eyes darting away. I noticed their habits, the way they patrolled with hurried steps, avoiding lingering in certain areas, especially the old wing, which was rumored to be closed off for reasons no one would explain. The atmosphere within Fort Harrison grew heavier with each passing day, the air thick with unspoken words and secrets. The prison itself seemed to be a living entity, its mood darkening, the stone walls colder, and the lights dimmer. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of a presence lingering just out of sight. One night, driven by a mix of determination and dread, I decided to confront Warden David. I found him in the old wing, standing before a cell that hadn't housed a prisoner in years. "Warden," I began, my voice firmer than I felt, "why do you walk these halls at night?" He turned, his expression inscrutable, the shadows playing across his face. "Some things," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "are best left undisturbed. Focus on your duties, Carter." In my early weeks, I sought camaraderie with my fellow guards, hoping to find some solace or explanation in shared experiences. Yet my attempts to breach the subject of the prison's unsettling atmosphere were met with nothing but stony silence and fleeting glances. It was as if an unspoken rule hung heavily in the air, a tacit agreement to maintain a facade of indifference. This silent rebuke from my peers only served to deepen my sense of isolation, making the expansive halls of Fort Harrison feel even more constricting. Despite the pervasive atmosphere of unease, my duties remained clear: maintain order and ensure the safety of those within these walls. The prisoners, however, seemed to share in the prison's secret dread. Men, once deemed the most dangerous and unforgiving of criminals, now appeared diminished, their usual bravado replaced by an unsettling quietude. Their fear was palpable, an infectious terror that seemed almost irrational when contrasted with their hardened demeanors. Yet witnessing their trembling hands and anxious glances, I couldn't help but wonder what had instilled such fear in them. This growing tension within the prison's walls did nothing to quell my own anxieties. If anything, it magnified them, each day layering new questions atop old, with no answers in sight. The more I observed, the more I allowed myself to really see, the less I understood. Fort Harrison, with its stoic guards and whispered legends, held secrets that seemed determined to remain unspoken. The day I encountered Big Jim marked a turning point in my tenure at Fort Harrison Penitentiary. Known among the inmates and guards alike for his ruthless behavior and a rap sheet that read like a crime novelist's fever dream, Big Jim was the embodiment of the type of criminal Fort Harrison was built to contain. Yet, as I stood before him, separated by the cold iron bars that had kept him from the world outside for so many years, I saw an unexpected vulnerability. Big Jim's cell was like any other in the high-security wing. Sparse, with peeling paint on the walls, and a single narrow window that barely let in light. But as I approached, clipboard in hand, ready to mark off another routine check, Big Jim's demeanor halted me. He was not the imposing figure I had expected, but rather a man visibly shaken, his massive frame hunched, and his eyes darting around the cell before settling on me with an intensity that was almost palpable. "It's watching," he whispered, the words barely escaping his throat. The fear in his voice was unmistakable, a stark contrast to the man whose reputation had preceded him. I paused, unsure how to respond. The air between us grew heavy, charged with an unspoken understanding that whatever was haunting Big Jim was not something that could be easily dismissed or contained. When I arrived here, I expected the usual difficulties associated with guarding dangerous criminals. But there was something inexplicable here. I had to figure out what was going on here. And the more I began to delve into the mysteries of the prison, the more I realized that the real danger was not behind bars. It was in the shadows, lurking in the corners, watching and waiting. The prison itself, with its labyrinthine corridors and shadowed corners, seemed to harbor secrets of its own. As the calendar pages turned, marking my tenure within the stone embrace of Fort Harrison Penitentiary, the unease that had greeted me upon my arrival deepened into a pervasive dread. The prison, with its cold iron bars and echoing corridors, had become a crucible of fear, its atmosphere thick with the tension of impending doom. The first of the deaths was as unexpected as it was gruesome. An inmate, known among his peers for his ruthless efficiency in the prison's underground hierarchy, was found at dawn's light, his lifeless body sprawled across the cold concrete floor of his cell. The scene was one of stark horror, his features frozen in a rictus of terror, eyes wide open and staring into oblivion, his limbs marked with deep, jagged wounds that bore no resemblance to the injuries one might expect in a prison fight. But it was only the beginning. Each morning thereafter seemed to usher in a new horror, another body discovered under similar macabre circumstances. The pattern was unmistakable. Each victim found with those same inexplicable wounds, their final moments marked by an evident terror that spoke of an encounter with something beyond the realm of understanding. The prison doctor, a man who had served Fort Harrison for decades and seen the gamut of human cruelty, was at a loss. His examinations revealed little beyond the obvious. The wounds were not made by any weapon he could identify, and there were no signs of a struggle, as if the victims had faced their end in a state of paralysis, overwhelmed by fear. As the death toll rose, so too did the fear among the inmates. The bravest among them, men who had faced down life sentences without flinching, were now seen huddled in their cells, whispering fervent prayers into the darkness. The prison's own rules and hierarchies seemed to crumble under the weight of this shared terror, alliances forgotten in the face of an enemy that could not be seen, fought, or understood. I found myself caught between my duties as a guard and the growing realization that Fort Harrison harbored a darkness far deeper than the crimes of its inmates. My rounds, once routine, had become a gauntlet of whispered pleas for protection and glimpses of fear-stricken faces peering out from behind steel doors. In the thick of my investigation into the unexplained deaths at Fort Harrison, my days became a blur of whispered confessions and covert glances. The prisoners, each ensnared by their own fears, began to open up about the horrors they believed lurked in the shadows. Their tales, steeped in the superstition of men grappling with the unknown, painted a picture of a prison haunted not by the misdeeds of its inhabitants, but by something far older and more malevolent. "These walls don't just hold the living," one inmate confided, his voice a low hiss as if afraid of being overheard by unseen ears. "They're a veil, thin and tearing between us and what waits on the other side." Each story shared a common thread: apparitions that defied explanation, dark figures seen from the corner of an eye, and an oppressive feeling of being watched. The more I listened, the more a chilling pattern emerged, weaving through the fabric of Fort Harrison's history like a dark stain. My inquiries, however, did not go unnoticed. The other guards were now watching me with a mixture of suspicion and caution. Their sidelong glances and the abrupt end to conversations when I approached spoke volumes of their wariness. It was clear that my quest for answers was stepping on sensitive ground, disturbing a status quo that had long governed the silent compacts within the prison's walls. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. I've been going through prison records looking for some clue that might explain what's going on here. The other guards now avoided me outright, their fear of what I might uncover perhaps greater than their fear of the prison's unseen resident. My investigation took on a new urgency, driven by the knowledge that whatever dwelled within Fort Harrison was not only real, but potentially dangerous. The deaths, the apparitions, the pervasive sense of dread, all pointed to a phenomenon that defied logical explanation. On an unusually quiet night at Fort Harrison Penitentiary, the silence was almost a physical entity, oppressive and foreboding. I was alone on night duty, navigating the maze of corridors with only the echo of my footsteps for company. The stillness was unsettling, a stark contrast to the daytime cacophony of clanging doors and shouted conversations. As I rounded a corner, my sense of unease crystallized into raw fear. There, at the far end of the corridor, illuminated by the feeble glow of the overhead lights, stood a figure. Its height was remarkable, towering over any inmate or staff member I had ever encountered. The silhouette hinted at a masculine form, but it was distorted, unnaturally bulky with a pronounced hump that spoke of something otherworldly. The figure was clad in the familiar garb of a prison guard, a dark uniform that should have been reassuring. Yet there was nothing comforting about this apparition. It stood motionless, a sentinel in the dim light, and as my eyes struggled to make sense of what I was seeing, a low growl emanated from its direction, a sound so deep it seemed to resonate within the very walls of Fort Harrison. My heart raced, thudding loudly in the silence, and for a moment I was paralyzed, caught in the primal fear of prey under the predator's gaze. The creature's head tilted slightly as if curious, and the growl intensified, a clear warning that was felt more than heard. Instincts I hadn't known I possessed surged to the forefront, propelling me to action. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing down the corridor as I fled the inexplicable horror behind me. The growl followed, a haunting sound that seemed to chase me through the twisting hallways of the prison. As I ran, the rational part of my mind grappled with what I had just witnessed. Questions spiraled through my thoughts with no logical answers to anchor them. Was it a trick of the light? A figment of my overwrought imagination? The chilling encounter with the creature, its towering form etched into my memory, left me trembling, my breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. I pressed myself into a recessed shadow, an attempt to merge with the stone and become invisible to whatever horrors roamed the halls. The creature's footsteps, heavy and foreboding, echoed through the corridors, a harbinger of dread that faded into the distance until all was silent once more. Yet, the silence brought no solace, only a deepening fear. Time lost meaning as I remained hidden, my heart racing in a futile bid for escape from my ribcage. When I finally dared to venture from my makeshift sanctuary, the oppressive atmosphere of the prison greeted me, a tangible cloak of terror that seemed to settle more heavily upon my shoulders than before. It was a stark realization, a moment of clarity in the midst of chaos. Fort Harrison was no mere prison but a hunting ground, and we, its inhabitants, were unwitting prey caught in a game we did not understand. The change in me did not go unnoticed. The other guards, men with whom I had shared countless shifts and mundane conversations, now regarded me with a mixture of suspicion and fear. Their glances, once indifferent or companionable, were now laden with wariness. They whispered among themselves, their words ceasing abruptly as I approached, leaving an unspoken tension hanging in the air. I could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the unasked questions that lingered in their eyes. What had I seen? What did I know? Nights became an ordeal, each shift a test of endurance. The once familiar sound of creaking floorboards or the soft whistle of the wind through the barred windows now carried ominous undertones. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and fraught with nightmares that mirrored the darkness of the prison's corridors. My waking hours were no less torturous, a ceaseless vigil against unseen threats that lurked in every shadow, every unwatched corner. The corridors I had once navigated with ease now seemed alien, transformed into a maze designed to disorient and terrify. The days were filled with a growing paranoia, an unshakable feeling of being watched. The prisoners, too, seemed to sense the shift within me, their gazes heavy with unspoken questions and fears of their own. Conversations were terse, punctuated by glances over shoulders and a palpable tension that permeated the very air. It was as if my encounter had marked me, set me apart not just from my fellow guards but from everyone within the prison's walls. As the weeks passed, the barrier between my professional facade and the terror that gnawed at my insides grew thinner. I found myself jumping at the slightest sound, a perpetual cold sweat clinging to my skin. My interactions with others became strained, my responses clipped, as I fought to maintain a semblance of normalcy in a situation that was anything but. My days were filled with paranoia. Each pair of eyes that met mine carried a silent question. Was it too much I knew? The corridors of Fort Harrison Penitentiary seemed longer as I made my way to Warden David's office, each step weighted with the burden of my mission. Reaching the door marked Warden, I paused, taking a moment to gather my thoughts and steady my resolve. The truth of my identity and my findings within these walls were a volatile mix, one that could either unlock the answers I sought or seal my fate within this place of shadows. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open, stepping into a room that mirrored the man who occupied it. Warden David, a man whose reputation for sternness and control preceded him, sat behind his desk, the embodiment of authority within the prison's hierarchy. His eyes, sharp and assessing, met mine as I entered, a silent challenge in their depths. It was a look I had seen many times before, but today it held a different weight. Today, I was not just a guard under his command, but a bearer of truths that could unravel the carefully maintained order of Fort Harrison. Gathering my courage, I broke the silence, my voice steady despite the turmoil within. "Warden David," I began, "there's something you need to know." The words flowed, a torrent of confessions and revelations that I could no longer contain. I spoke of my true identity as a police officer sent undercover to investigate the dark occurrences within the prison, of the deaths that defied explanation, and of the creature that lurked in the shadows, a presence both terrifying and unexplainable. Warden David listened, his expression unreadable, as I laid bare the fears and suspicions that had plagued me since my arrival. The monstrous apparition, the whispers of ancient evils bound within the stone walls, the inexplicable dread that had taken hold of both guards and inmates alike. It was all laid out before him, a puzzle that only he might have the pieces to complete. As my tale came to an end, a heavy silence fell between us. The warden's face, usually so impassive, betrayed a flicker of something unidentifiable. Was it recognition? Fear? The moment stretched, a chasm of uncertainty that threatened to swallow me whole. In the moments following my revelation to Warden David, time seemed to stand still. The silence in the office, a suffocating blanket that wrapped itself around me. His reaction, however, was not the one I had anticipated. The slow spread of his smile, a chilling display of amusement and malice, signaled a turn in events that I was wholly unprepared for. "Is that so?" His voice, a low drawl, was laced with a tone that sent a shiver down my spine. It was the sound of a trap snapping shut, the finality of a door closing on the last sliver of hope. The warden's next actions were swift, a choreographed response that spoke of premeditation. With a casual stride, he moved to the door, opening it with a flourish to summon the guards stationed outside. Their entrance was a silent storm, a coordinated movement of bodies trained to respond to the warden's unspoken commands. Their expressions, a disturbing echo of David's own unsettling smile, offered no comfort, no hint of hesitation as they advanced. The realization of my predicament crystallized in that moment, the walls of the office closing in as I found myself the focus of their predatory attention. Before I could muster a response, a protest or plea for understanding, their hands were upon me, their grip unyielding. The betrayal stung, a sharp contrast to the camaraderie I had once shared with these men. Dragged from the room, my attempts to reason, to explain, were lost in the chaos of the moment, unheard or simply ignored. The journey through the corridors of Fort Harrison was a blur, the familiar paths now a labyrinth leading to my own imprisonment. The stares of inmates and guards alike bore into me, a mixture of confusion and curiosity that went unanswered as I was propelled forward. Thrown into a cell, the cold embrace of the concrete floor was a harsh welcome. The sound of the door slamming shut, the finality of the lock clicking into place, echoed in the cramped space, a grim punctuation to the rapid change in my circumstances. In the span of moments, I had transitioned from investigator to inmate, a player in the twisted game that Fort Harrison seemed to thrive on. The cell, a stark, barren space that offered no comfort, became my new reality. Its walls, cold and unyielding, were not just a physical barrier but a symbolic one, marking the line between the freedom I had taken for granted and the confinement that was now my lot. As I settled into the reality of my confinement, I knew that the coming days would test me in ways I had yet to imagine. Trapped within the stark confines of Fort Harrison Penitentiary, each day became a battle for sanity, a test of endurance. The cell that held me was both sanctuary and prison, a place of relative safety that also served as a constant reminder of my powerless state. The creature that stalked the corridors of Fort Harrison was an ever-present threat, a shadowy predator that haunted my thoughts and fueled my nightmares. I found myself cataloging the hours by the sounds that penetrated my cell, the distant clanging of doors, the muffled footsteps of guards on their rounds, and most unnervingly, the periodic growls of the creature that lurked unseen. These sounds were the soundtrack to my confinement, a relentless reminder of the horror that lay just beyond the reach of sight. At night, the prison transformed. The absence of daylight did nothing to stifle the presence of the creature. If anything, it seemed to embolden it. The growls grew louder, closer, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. The screams of the prisoners, those unfortunate enough to encounter the beast, pierced the heavy silence, each one a stark testament to the deadly game of predator and prey played out in the darkness. The question of the creature's existence, its origins and purpose within the walls of Fort Harrison consumed me. Why did Warden David protect it? What pact had been made that allowed such a monster to roam free? These questions circled endlessly in my mind, a maze with no exit in sight. Days melded into each other in the dim confines of my cell, marked only by the scant light that crept through the small, barred window. The monotony of confinement was a torment of its own, each moment stretching into eternity, punctuated only by the distant echoes of footsteps and the occasional distant scream that shattered the oppressive silence of Fort Harrison Penitentiary. Fear was a constant companion, an ever-present shadow that loomed larger with each passing day. It was not just the fear of the unseen creature that stalked the prison corridors or the inexplicable events that had led to my wrongful imprisonment. It was the fear of the unknown, of what fate awaited me within these walls that seemed to close in a little more with each passing moment. Hunger gnawed at me, both physical and mental. The meager rations that were pushed through the slot in the door did little to sate the emptiness that had taken root in my stomach. But it was the hunger for answers, for some shred of understanding in the midst of this nightmare, that was truly insatiable. Isolation was its own form of torture. The silence of the cell was a heavy, tangible thing, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the occasional muffled noises that filtered in from the outside. I longed for human contact, for a voice that wasn't my own echoing off the cold stone walls. When the day came that I was finally let out into the courtyard, the sensation was surreal. The open sky above me was a stark contrast to the oppressive gloom of my cell. Despite the chill in the air, there was a momentary surge of relief, a fleeting sense of freedom that came with being outside the confines of my cell. The courtyard was a bleak expanse of concrete, surrounded by the towering walls of the prison. Other prisoners milled about, shadows of men worn down by the rigors of their confinement. Their faces were gaunt, eyes hollow, each one a testament to the harsh reality of life within Fort Harrison. In my desperation for answers, I approached them, seeking any fragment of information that might shed light on the situation. Their reactions were a mix of fear and resignation, a silent communication that spoke volumes of the horrors they had endured. The truth of their silence was more horrifying than I could have imagined. The sight of their mutilated tongues was a shock, a visceral reminder of the price of speaking out within these walls. It was a brutal enforcement of the prison's code of silence, a rule that was maintained at a horrifying cost. The realization that these men had been so cruelly silenced was a turning point. The horror of their mutilation, the depth of the cruelty it represented, was a stark revelation of the lengths to which the administration would go to maintain their secrets. My time in the courtyard, brief as it was, became a moment of profound clarity. The faces of the other prisoners, marked by suffering and fear, were a mirror reflecting the grim reality of Fort Harrison. It was a place where humanity was stripped away, where unspeakable horrors were hidden behind a facade of routine and silence. Back in the confines of my cell, the cold, hard floor became a stark reminder of my own helplessness. The chilling air of the night brushed against my skin as the heavy door to my cell creaked open, an ominous sound that signaled the beginning of an unforeseen horror. Warden David, flanked by a cadre of guards, stood at the threshold, his presence a dark omen. The usual sternness of his demeanor was replaced with a disturbing smile, one that did not reach the cold depths of his eyes. "We're going for a walk," he announced, his voice devoid of the customary authority, instead imbued with an unsettling cheer. The chains that bound my wrists felt heavier than ever as I was escorted out of the cell, a silent procession through the dimly lit corridors of Fort Harrison Penitentiary. The night air hit me with a biting chill as we stepped into the open yard, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the interior. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the prison, transforming the familiar yard into a scene from a nightmare. The sense of foreboding deepened as Warden David stopped, surveying the assembled prisoners with a gaze that seemed to pierce through the darkness. "The table is set," he declared, his voice echoing off the stone walls, filling the space with a sense of dread. The ambiguity of his words did nothing to quell the growing fear among us, a collective apprehension that tightened its grip with each passing moment. Without warning, the transformation began. It was a spectacle that defied logic, a grotesque display of nature twisted. The guards, men I had known, whose faces were as familiar as the cell I occupied, began to contort and shift before our very eyes. Their bodies elongated, muscles bulging and bones cracking in a horrific symphony of metamorphosis. Within moments, The human forms gave way to monstrous silhouettes, creatures of nightmare that stood on two legs, their features wolf-like and ferocious. The growls that erupted from their throats were primal, a sound that resonated with the most basic instinct of fear. The warden, the orchestrator of this nightmarish tableau, stood unchanged, his smile widening as he watched the transformation unfold, a malevolent spectator to the carnage that was about to commence. Paralyzed by terror, I could only watch as the creatures advanced on the prisoners. The screams that filled the night were a testament to the horror that unfolded under the cold gaze of the moon. One by one, the prisoners fell, their cries cut short by the merciless onslaught of the beasts that had once been their guards. The yard, a place that had once represented a brief respite from the confines of the cell, had become a hunting ground, the stage for a gruesome feast. The creatures moved with terrifying efficiency, their forms bathed in moonlight as they tore through flesh and bone. The morning after the night's unspeakable events, Fort Harrison Penitentiary resumed its deceptive guise of order and control. The sun's rays, breaking over the prison's high walls, cast long shadows that seemed to mock the darkness that had enveloped the yard just hours before. As Warden David, I observed the aftermath from the confines of my office, the room a silent testament to the duality of my existence within these walls. The cleanup had been swift, the bodies of the fallen prisoners removed with a cold, detached efficiency. It was a routine perfected over time, a grim choreography that the guards executed with practiced indifference. The yard, now empty, bore no trace of the horror that had transpired, the ground scrubbed clean of the evidence of our nocturnal activities. In the days that followed, a heavy silence settled over Fort Harrison, a palpable sense of fear that permeated the stone and steel. The prisoners, those who had survived the night, were visibly changed. They huddled in their cells, their conversations mere whispers, their eyes wide and haunted by what they had witnessed. It was a silence born of terror, a mute testament to the power I wielded over them. The guards, my loyal pack, patrolled the corridors with a newfound sense of purpose. Their smiles, thin and cold, were a reminder to all of the consequences of defiance. They moved with the confidence of those who had embraced their true nature, their transformation from man to beast, now an open secret among the prison population. My position as warden of Fort Harrison, a role I had once assumed with a sense of duty, had evolved. The prison, in my eyes, was a masterpiece of control, a domain where the line between man and monster blurred. The punishment system I had perfected was not just effective. It was a work of art, a delicate balance of fear, obedience, and the occasional unleashing of primal instincts. As I sat in my office, the walls adorned with the reminders of my authority, I contemplated the events of the previous night with a sense of satisfaction. The transformation, the hunt, the feast, it was all necessary, a demonstration of power that reinforced the hierarchy within Fort Harrison. Picking up the phone, I dialed the number of the main office, the routine report ready on my lips. The story of a riot, a fabrication designed to explain away the loss of life, was a narrative I had employed before. It was believable, a scenario that fit neatly into the expectations of those who sought to question the happenings within the prison's walls. "There's been a riot at the prison," I began, my voice calm, detached from the gravity of the lie I was about to tell. "Fortunately, it has been dealt with, but unfortunately, we have casualties." The words were a rehearsed script, a veil of deceit that masked the true nature of our nocturnal activities. The mention of Alex Carter, a name now tied to a tale of tragic loss, was the final stroke of the brush on the canvas of lies I had painted. "A young guard named Alex Carter was killed during the confrontation," I reported. A statement that would no doubt elicit sympathy and perhaps even admiration for the way the situation had been handled. The call was a necessary step, a move in the intricate game of shadows and lies that I played. It was a declaration of my control, not just over Fort Harrison, but over the narrative that surrounded it. The prison, my kingdom, was a place where horrors lurked in the shadows, where the line between man and monster was erased, and where I, Warden David, ruled with an iron fist cloaked in velvet. As I hung up the phone, the silence of the office enveloped me once more. Fort Harrison Penitentiary, with its cold, unforgiving walls and its inhabitants, both human and otherwise, was a reflection of the world as I saw it, a place where power was the only currency of value, and where survival depended on the recognition of the beasts that dwelled within us all.
Story 4.
I leaned back in the worn-out leather chair, the polished badge on my chest reflecting the stark fluorescent light of my office. As the warden of the newest prison in the state, the job was a point of pride for me. My name is Jack, and this prison, this concrete giant, was supposed to be my legacy. This prison was my design, my brainchild. State-of-the-art security systems, electronically locked cells that could stand up to the most determined inmates, and surveillance cameras that left no corner unwatched. We even had drone patrols on the perimeter. Every detail was meticulously crafted, every loophole thoroughly examined. It was an impenetrable fortress, a testament to modern technology and architecture. 3 months since we'd opened the doors, 3 months since the first batch of prisoners had stepped onto the cold, pristine tiles, and things had started to shift. It began subtly. Cells would power down for no discernible reason, leaving guards scrambling to manually lock them down. Surveillance feeds would go static, only to return to normal with no evidence of tampering. My IT guys were pulling their hair out, unable to find any bugs in the system. Then, the rumors started among the guards. They spoke in hushed whispers about strange odors permeating the prison, like sulfur and rotting meat. They complained about unsettling noises during the graveyard shift, a chorus of low growls and scuttling sounds that echoed through the empty corridors. I dismissed these as mere figments of overactive imaginations, fueled by the late-night ghost stories some of the older guards liked to share. But then the inmates started talking. Hardened men, criminals who had seen the worst humanity had to offer, began murmuring about something in the dark. They talked about small, shadowy figures that skulked around their cells. Days passed, and the strange occurrences continued. The random system failures, the odd smells, the eerie sounds. The prison felt heavy, like a storm was brewing, an unseen tension hanging in the air. The guards started taking leaves, some even quit without notice. The inmates grew more restless, their sleep plagued by nightmares. The prison, once my monument of order and control, was slowly turning into a house of fear and mystery. The worst part was, I felt powerless, unable to quell the rising tide of panic. In the lunchroom, I overheard more stories from the inmates. Tales of shadowy figures that moved with an inhuman speed, whispers that filled their ears with unspeakable horrors, and the smell of decay that seemed to seep from the walls. One day, on my rounds, I found the cell of one of the most dangerous criminals empty. The bed was neatly made, personal belongings stacked in a corner. There was no note, no explanation. The prisoner had simply disappeared. The prison was quiet that day, the deafening silence drowning out the familiar clanking of metal doors and distant conversations. I retired to my office, an uneasy feeling gnawing at me. Prison, my prison, was no longer a symbol of justice or order. It was now turning into a place of incomprehensible horror. And I, her warden, was forced to wrestle with the fear and uncertainty that hung over her like a shroud. As the day drew to a close, I found myself standing at the edge of the prison yard, staring up at the high concrete walls. They seemed to loom over me, casting long, dark shadows that stretched across the ground like skeletal fingers. Days turned into weeks, each one blending into the next in a monotonous, eerie rhythm. The strange occurrences in the prison became our new normal. The fear, once a disquieting undercurrent, now surged like a tidal wave, enveloping us all in its icy grip. The inmates, men who had once stood tall and defiant, were breaking. I could see it in their eyes, a vacant look that spoke of a terror I couldn't fathom. Some would cower in the corners of their cells, their bodies shaking with an inexplicable fear. Food trays were returned untouched, the inmates' appetites stolen by the dread that permeated the prison. Some took to self-harm, their bodies becoming canvases of their torment. Deep gashes and burn marks littered their skin, a gruesome testament to their desperate attempts to drown out the fear. Suicide attempts became a grim routine, with guards on constant vigil to thwart their desperate attempts at escape. And then, the disappearances started. Guards, especially those on night duty, would vanish without a trace. Their lockers would remain untouched, their uniforms neatly folded. They left behind confused families and an atmosphere of dread that hung over the prison like a death shroud. Days later, they would be found. Some were dead, their bodies showing signs of severe trauma, their faces frozen in an eternal expression of terror. Those who were found alive were no better off. They were catatonic, their eyes vacant, their minds seemingly lost it. The prison was crumbling, not in its physical form, but in its very essence. The fear was not just in the minds of the inmates and guards, it had seeped into the walls, the floors, the air. My nights were restless, filled with nightmares of shadowy figures and disquieting whispers. Sleep, once a refuge, had become a battleground, my dreams a mirror to the horrors unfolding in the prison. One night, as I tossed and turned in my bed, I woke up to a chilling sight. A small, shadowy figure stood by the foot of my bed, its face obscured by the darkness. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and it stared at me, its gaze penetrating the veil of fear and sleep. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, staring, its presence an embodiment of the prison's unseen terror. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving behind an eerie silence that echoed my pounding heart. That encounter marked a turning point. The prison was not just a breeding ground for fear and horror. It was now a portal to the unknown, a bridge between our world and something far more sinister. Days turned into a blur, the fear a constant companion. My once bustling office was now a solitary haven, the steady hum of the surveillance monitors a haunting lullaby. Every flicker of the screen, every static buzz, sent chills down my spine, amplifying the feeling of impending doom. As I surveyed the prison through the grainy footage, I felt a deep sense of despair. The men I was responsible for, both guards and inmates alike, were falling apart. Their hollow eyes, their gaunt faces, their trembling hands, all telling a story of a fear that gnawed at their sanity. I tried to keep up the semblance of order, arranging counseling sessions for the inmates, bringing in psychologists and spiritual leaders, but it was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with a bucket. One night, I found myself in the control room, staring at a wall of monitors displaying the static-filled images of the prison. A sudden movement caught my eye. On one of the screens, I saw a guard making his rounds. It was Thompson, one of the few who hadn't left or disappeared. He was a brave man, a former Marine who held onto his duty like a lifeline amidst the chaos. As I watched him patrol the empty corridor, I noticed something. Small, shadowy figures skulking behind him, their glowing eyes visible even through the grainy footage. I watched in horror as they closed in on him, their forms merging with the shadows. I found myself on my feet, my heart pounding in my chest as I sprinted down the hallway. I arrived at the corridor just in time to see Thompson turn around, his face going white as he stared at the empty space behind him. He collapsed, his body convulsing as he clutched his chest. I ran to him, my mind racing as I called for help over the radio. But I knew it was too late. The life faded from his eyes as he stared past me, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. His final words, a hoarse whisper that chilled me to the bone. "They're here." In the end, it all came down to the fact that the police came to us. They had to find out the cause of a series of unexplained tragedies. The arrival of the police was a mere formality, a nod to the semblance of order in the face of an unknowable terror. They roamed the hollow corridors, their faces masked by a thin veneer of professionalism, barely concealing the undercurrent of dread. The investigations were thorough, a maze of questioning, evidence gathering, and futile attempts to piece together the puzzle. But the prison was an enigma that defied logic, a monument to the inexplicable and the unseen. The remaining guards went about their duties with an air of resignation, their faces mirroring the hopelessness that had become our shared reality. 5 days into the investigation, something changed. As I walked down the all-too-familiar corridor, a sudden chill crept up my spine. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest as I felt a presence, an otherworldly sensation that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Turning around, I was met with a sight that will haunt me till my dying day. There they were, the shadowy figures not confined to the corners of my eye but standing right before me. They were small, like children, their faces twisted into expressions of rage and terror. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. The figures advanced, their forms flickering like a mirage, their whispers growing louder. I turned and ran, the horrifying apparitions hot on my heels. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted down the hallway, my breaths coming in short gasps. Just as I felt my strength waning, I made it to the control room. Slamming the door behind me, I collapsed against it, my body shaking from the adrenaline and fear. I was safe for now. But the reprieve was short-lived. A sudden heat gripped the room, and a bright orange glow illuminated the corridor outside. Flames erupted from the bowels of the prison, consuming everything in its path. The prison was burning. I didn't have a moment to waste. Grabbing the radio, I sounded the alarm, instructing everyone to evacuate immediately. The flames spread quickly, the heat turning the concrete walls into a furnace. The prison was ablaze, the once imposing structure reduced to a fiery skeleton. But we had made it out, a small victory amidst the overwhelming loss. The police cordoned off the area, their faces reflecting the shock and awe of the unfolding spectacle. Despite the best efforts of the investigators, no explanation was found for the series of tragic and mysterious events. The prison was closed, its remnants a grim reminder of the horror that had unfolded within its walls.
Story 5.
I could feel the weight of the past as we approached the imposing edifice. The prison, long abandoned, squatted in the twilight like a brooding monolith, its silence only surpassed by the centuries-old secrets it guarded. It was a place where laughter had died, replaced by a mournful symphony of iron bars clashing and cries echoing in the wind. I shivered, not from the cool evening breeze but from a sense of foreboding, a premonition of the strange mysteries that awaited us. "Are you all right, Jake?" Meredith, our group's self-proclaimed spiritual guide, asked, her hazel eyes studying me with an unsettling intensity. "Just thinking about the place," I replied, my voice barely a whisper, my gaze unflinchingly fixed on the prison's austere facade. "It's more than just a building, you know. It's a tomb of stories. Each brick, each stone, is drenched in tales of despair and sorrow," she intoned, her voice lending an eerie cadence to the hush of the evening. Her words hung in the air like an ominous prophecy, making me more aware of the daunting task ahead. We were not just amateur paranormal enthusiasts. We were storytellers, ready to narrate a tale that had been muted by the walls of this prison. Our team was an eclectic mix. Meredith, the spiritual guide, Paul, the tech wizard, and me, Jake, the aspiring writer who believed that every story deserved to be told, no matter how unsettling. Paul was busy fiddling with his equipment, an array of devices designed to sense the slightest hint of paranormal activity. "We're all set," he announced, his voice barely concealing the excitement. As we crossed the threshold, the chilling air wrapped around us like a shroud. The echo of our footsteps seemed to breathe life into the long-forgotten tales of the prison. The decrepit walls, stained with age, wore an eerie silence, as if they were waiting for the right moment to unfold their narrative. Paul, ever the pragmatist, was the first to break the silence. "The electromagnetic readings are off the charts here. Something is definitely up," he stated, his eyes never leaving the device in his hand. Meredith nodded. "I can feel a strong energy presence. There is a heaviness that is overpowering." I could feel it too. A strange pressure that seemed to push against us. A silent resistance from the ghostly inhabitants of the prison. It was as if the air was thick with the untold stories of the past, hanging in the balance between the world of the living and the dead. We decided to explore the cell block first, a long, dim corridor lined with decrepit cells. Each cell held a tale of its own, the rusted iron bars a testament to the lives that had been confined within. The silence was punctuated only by our own soft footsteps and the occasional creak of the prison settling into its nightly slumber. As I stood in front of one cell, an inexplicable sense of dread washed over me. It was as if I could feel the despair of the inmate who had once occupied the space. The worn-out cot, the barren walls, and the small window that offered but a glimpse of the outside world were stark reminders of a life spent in isolation. "I can sense a strong presence here," Meredith said, her voice a hushed whisper as she stood beside me, her eyes closed in concentration. As the words left her mouth, Paul's device began to beep wildly. "Guys, we've got something here," he said, his voice echoing down the corridor. His eyes, wide with anticipation, were glued to the screen of his device. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier, as if time itself was bending under the weight of the untold stories. I felt an unseen presence, a whisper of the past that still lingered within the stone-cold walls. Meredith shivered and pulled her coat tighter around her. "There's a sadness here," she murmured. "A despair that's been imprinted on these walls." I could feel it too, a palpable sorrow that hung heavy in the air. I thought about the countless souls that had been confined within these walls, the stories of their lives etched into the very fabric of the building. The chilling reality of their existence seemed to seep into my bones, filling me with a sense of dread that was as real as the cold stone beneath my feet. Suddenly a faint sound echoed through the corridor. It was a soft, melancholic hum, barely audible yet undeniably present. We froze, our breath hitching in our throats. Paul's device began to beep wildly, the frantic rhythm matching the pounding of my heart. The hum grew louder, filling the corridor with a haunting melody that was as beautiful as it was chilling. It was a song of despair, a lament of lost freedom. The song reverberated around us, its melody weaving a chilling tale of sorrow and despair. We stood there transfixed as the haunting melody washed over us, touching the deepest corners of our souls. It was as if the prison was finally ready to share its secrets, its walls breaking their centuries-long silence. "Did you hear that?" Paul finally broke the silence, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at us, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. "We heard it," I replied, my voice barely audible. The haunting melody still echoed in my mind, its chilling notes a stark reminder of the dark secrets that the prison held. We moved deeper into the building, the only light coming from Paul's handheld device and the glow of our flashlights dancing on the decaying walls. The eerie song from before hung over us like a specter, our ears straining for any trace of the haunting melody. Yet, the prison remained silent, its narrative suspended in the cold air. As we ventured further into the labyrinth, Meredith's expression turned graver. "The energy is stronger here," she muttered, her hand fluttering over her heart. "It's almost overwhelming." Paul looked at his device, then at Meredith. "The readings corroborate what you're saying," he said, his voice holding an edge of apprehension that I had never heard before. I watched them, my mind teetering between skepticism and belief. The eerie atmosphere, the chilling melody, the inexplicable cold spots. It was hard to dismiss it all as mere coincidence. The prison was seeping into us, its history, its dread, its despair. We found ourselves standing in front of the solitary confinement cells, the most dreaded section of the prison. The air was markedly colder here, the silence more oppressive. The barred doors hung open, revealing the darkness within. Entering the first cell, I felt the space close in around me. The walls seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, the echoes of past suffering reverberating through the air. I imagined a prisoner, trapped within these four walls, his pleas for mercy drowned by the stone-cold silence. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the cell, causing me to shudder. I heard Meredith gasp, and I turned to see her standing at the doorway, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. "Did you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The despair, the agony." I nodded, unable to find my voice. I could feel it too, the remnants of fear and despair etched into the very essence of the cell. Paul, who had been quiet, suddenly let out a low whistle. "Guys, you need to see this," he said, his device pointed at the far wall. A faint outline glowed on the screen, an outline that bore an uncanny resemblance to a human figure. My heart hammered in my chest as I looked from the screen to the empty cell. There was nothing there, yet Paul's device indicated otherwise. We have a presence," Paul stammered, his normally calm demeanor replaced by nervous excitement. Meredith took a step back, her face pale. "I can feel it too," she said, her voice trembling. "It S ... IT S so strong." For a moment we stood in silence, a sense of awe and dread filling the cell. We were not alone. The prison was alive, its inhabitants unseen but undeniably present. The sudden realization sent a chill down my spine. The prison was not just a building, it was a living entity, a container for the souls who had been wronged, their cries for justice echoing through the ages. A faint whisper broke the silence, a chilling reminder of the presence that lurked in the shadows. The whisper grew louder, filling the cell with a melancholic symphony that echoed the despair etched into the prison walls. The further we ventured, the stronger the feelings became. Despair, sorrow, anger, fear. It was as if we were walking through a gallery of human emotions, each cell a canvas painted with the shades of human suffering. Suddenly, Meredith halted, her hand flying to her chest. "Something's not right," she murmured, her eyes darting around nervously. Paul and I exchanged glances. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice echoing in the hollow corridor. She swallowed hard, her face pale. There's something else here," she said, her voice trembling. "Something dark." A chill ran down my spine at her words. The prison was already a hub of despair and suffering. What could possibly be darker than that? Paul's device began to beep wildly, the red lights flashing ominously. "She's right," he said, his voice strained. "The readings are off the charts. There's something else here with us." Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the corridor, the chilling touch sending shivers down my spine. The air seemed to crackle with an unseen energy, a dark presence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We stood there, frozen in our tracks, as the prison echoed with a haunting melody. It was the same song from before, but this time it held a darker tone. It was a lament, a plea for mercy from the depths of despair. As the song faded, we were left standing in the oppressive silence, the echo of the haunting melody hanging in the air. "We need to tread carefully," Meredith said, her voice barely a whisper. "There's more to this place than we imagined." I nodded, my mind racing with the horrifying possibilities. We descended further into the heart of the prison, the darkness swallowing us whole. The air was thicker here, laden with a despair so palpable that it was almost suffocating. The walls, drenched in centuries-old secrets, seemed to breathe along with us, their cold stone surfaces pulsing with an unseen energy. Meredith was visibly shaken, her usual calm demeanor replaced by a nervous tension that made her movements jerky. Paul, on the other hand, was a picture of concentration, his gaze fixed on his device, his fingers dancing over the buttons as he attempted to decipher the unseen presence around us. The eerie silence was broken by the occasional beep from Paul's device, each one a chilling reminder of the invisible inhabitants of the prison. As we moved further into the labyrinth, the beeps grew more frequent, the unseen presence growing stronger. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the corridor, causing us to jump in alarm. It sounded like a door slamming shut, its echo reverberating through the stone walls. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Paul nodded, his face pale. "It came from that direction," he said, pointing towards a dimly lit corridor. With bated breath, we made our way towards the sound. The corridor led us to a large iron door. It was closed, its cold, rusty surface emanating an aura of dread. "This is it," Meredith murmured, her voice trembling. "This is where the dark energy is strongest." Paul's device was beeping wildly, the red lights flashing ominously. "She's right," he said, his voice strained. "There's definitely something in there." With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. A chill ran down my spine as we stepped into the room. It was a large, open space, the air heavy with the scent of decay. The room was unlike any other we had encountered so far. The walls were lined with chains, their rusty surfaces a stark reminder of the torture that had taken place within these four walls. A large wooden table stood in the middle of the room, its surface stained with dried blood. The room was a living nightmare, a testament to the horrors that had been inflicted upon the prisoners. The chains rattled softly, the eerie sound echoing through the room. It was as if the room was reliving its past, its walls whispering the tales of horror and suffering. I can't stay here," Meredith murmured, her face pale. "The energy IT quote S too much." I nodded, my own heart hammering in my chest. The room was a vortex of negative energy, its aura of dread almost suffocating. As we turned to leave, a soft whisper echoed through the room. It was a plea, a cry for mercy from the depths of despair. The whisper grew louder, filling the room with a chilling symphony of pain and suffering. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, the chilling touch sending shivers down my spine. "We're not alone," Paul whispered, his voice barely audible. I could feel it too, the unseen presence lurking in the shadows. The room was alive, its inhabitants unseen but undeniably present. The walls seemed to close in around us, their cold stone surfaces pulsing with the heartbeats of the souls trapped within. Let's get out of here," Meredith stuttered, her voice trembling. Paul, despite his fascination with the supernatural, was quick to agree. His device, still beeping wildly, was a stark reminder of the unseen presence around us. The door, however, refused to budge. No matter how hard we pushed, it stood firm, as if held shut by some unseen force. Panic started to seep in, a cold, clawing fear that gripped our hearts. We were trapped, locked within the room that was a living testament to the horrors of the past. The walls seemed to close in around us, their cold stone surfaces pulsing with an unseen energy. Then, as suddenly as it had slammed shut, the door swung open. We stumbled out, our hearts pounding, the taste of fear fresh on our tongues. The corridor outside was a welcome relief, its air free of the oppressive dread that had filled the room. As we caught our breaths, I couldn't help but look back at the room. It was a portal into the past, a mirror reflecting the horrors that had taken place within the prison walls. The room had shared its secrets, its walls breaking their centuries-long silence to reveal the tales of horror and suffering. That night, as we huddled together in the relative safety of the prison's entrance hall, I couldn't shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me. The prison was a living entity, its walls whispering the tales of horror and despair. It was a tomb of stories, each one darker than the last.